How I Met Your Mother is in this unfortunate position of being an incredibly useful and easily accessible tool for teaching media literacy, while at the same time being extremely and understandably off-putting for a lot of young people. From a technical standpoint, it is shockingly well written for the era of sitcom that it comes from, specifically in a way that makes it so easy to teach interpretation, critical thinking, genre, forms, literary devices, foundational media literacy skills. While Crazy Ex-Girlfriend did this through satire that tells you it's satire, How I Met Your Mother does this through layers of exaggerated and unreliable narration. The premise of the show is in 2030, Ted is telling his kids the story of how he met their mother. And we are watching that story in what feels like real time. But the show never forgets that we are being told a story in which the narrator has future information and can lie. And very often we will see lies told by these characters played out for us and then later see that they were actually false. For example, at the end of season 1, Lily leaves her fiancé Marshall to do an art fellowship in San Francisco. And when she comes back, we watch the story that she tells them of what her time was like.
Oh my God. This is your best work. In all my years teaching, I've never seen anything so... Needless to say, this is art. I can't teach you anything.
It appears she had a good time, and that's what she wants them all to think. But later in the episode, we see what really happened.
Oh my God. This is your best work? In all my years teaching, I've never seen anything so needless. To say this is art. I can't teach you anything.
She twisted what happened without changing a single word so it would feel less like a lie to her. She wanted to believe that she made the right decision, but she knew that she didn't. And it's very rare to find a sitcom that will use this layer of unreliable narration because, remember, we're being told this story from Ted. He already knows that Lily is lying, but he still tells the story to his children as if it were true and then let them experience the same reveal that he did. The media studies nerd in me loses it about scenes like this, and it's everywhere in this show. We also see like a lot of imagined realities and what if scenarios for Ted to tell like a larger point. And especially as the show goes on, it plays around a lot with future time and changing around when we see things versus when they actually happen. If you simply remember that we are being told a story from future Ted, which the show frequently reminds you, it can help you study and understand media in a very accessible way. With all of that in mind, it's unfortunate that a lot of jokes have not aged well. It relies very heavily on assumptions of gender that are just not as prevalent now, especially for younger people. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with the trans jokes and especially Barney's sexism throughout the show, which is understandable. And if we were in a media studies class, this would be a lot easier of a tool to use because we could deconstruct those elements. But like with any show, I think there's plenty of bad elements that can be unpacked, but also good ones as well. And there's a lot of interesting stuff you can take away from it. It all really depends on how comfortable you are with poorly aged jokes. There are a lot of good and bad video essays on this show in all directions. I recommend checking some out if you get a chance. First off, I just want to say I love that people are thinking about the unreliability of Ted's narration. And if part of that for you is believing that Ted made Barney seem worse than he actually is, that's fine. I'm not judging this commenter or anybody else who thinks that. However, I personally see some problems with this reading, especially this aspect of it. It doesn't really make sense for Ted's main motive for making Barney seem worse being that he wants the kids to be comfortable with him getting with Robin, because the kids have never known a time when Robin and Barney were together. Like, sure, they may have heard they were married at some point, but Ted's daughter was born in 2015 and they got divorced in 2016. And Ted's son was born after that. Both of his kids know them as individuals, not as a unit. So it doesn't really make sense to make Barney look bad for this reason. If anything, there's motive to make Robin look good. But even aside from the whole Barney-Robin thing, there's a lot of evidence within the text itself that point to Ted not trying to make Barney seem extra worse than he already is. Like, Ted shows his kids a growth arc for Barney, but also very frequently refers to him as a good good friend and, like, fun to be around. And to be clear, I'm talking about what Ted thinks of him, not necessarily what we think of him. Despite all of Barney's flaws that the group is happy to bring up, they are still very much friends with him. And the whole last season, the last things that Ted is telling his kids about Barney very much make him seem better than the rest of the show has. He is still deeply flawed, but he's gone through character growth, and it wouldn't make sense for Ted to describe Barney in this way if he wanted the kids to think badly of him. On the reverse end, Ted does not actually make himself seem like a good guy in a lot of these scenarios. In fact, he frequently refers to himself as the jerk in a lot of situations. Yes, he is trying to romanticize the idea of him getting with Robin as this sort of long romantic journey, but he's also romanticizing the idea of their mother and trying to teach them life lessons. A lot of the episodes, especially in the early seasons, are sort of parables, like what to do and what not to do in terms of dating. And we may disagree on Ted's conclusion in a lot of these, but he is not trying to make himself look good all the time. In fact, everyone in the cast is very deeply flawed. They're not good people, which is part of the point. Like a lot of shows, they are not pinnacles of morality. They are deeply flawed because humans are flawed. All that being said, sure, Ted might have over-exaggerated the character traits of his friends, but I don't think it was to make himself look better than them or that it was especially so for Barney. And I think the reason people want it to be is because of this conundrum of Ted and Barney's likability. A lot of people hate both of these characters, but a lot more people find Barney likable than those that find Ted. In fact, Barney was pretty consistently the most popular character on the show, which is a whole other conversation we can get into, and people really do not like Ted. So I get why people feel like Ted is insufferable and want to make Barney more appealing, but it's important to remember that if Ted is lying, this is not the real Barney. The real Barney is never seen. You can enjoy a character who's a bad person while acknowledging that they are a bad person. You don't have to make them good or justify their actions. And if you have a different reason for believing that Ted might be over-embellishing Barney or, like, changing his character in some way, I would love to hear it. Like, I am not super opposed to this idea if there's evidence for it. This is just my perspective, and if you've thought of something I haven't, I genuinely would love to hear it. Even though a lot of people don't like laugh tracks, they definitely can be a useful tool in helping less aware viewers develop media literacy, and there's some unique aspects to How I Met Your Mother's laugh track in particular that are worth discussing.
Hey! Bravo, 现在是讲。
No way. That did not just happen.
Am I dead? Am I dead?
Most sitcoms with audience laughter are filmed in front of a live studio audience. This is why shows like Friends have the actor pause after a joke. They're waiting for an actual audience to stop laughing.
First, Chandler and Monica will get married and be filthy rich, by the way. Yeah. But it won't work out.
Wow.
I know. Then I'm going to marry Chandler for the money, and you'll marry Rachel and have the beautiful kids.
Great.
But then we ditch those two, and that's when we get married.
I gotta talk to you.
Sure. What's up?
Monica and I almost got married last night.
Some shows do use canned laughter, which is usually pre-recorded stock laugh sounds from the 50s. Even some shows filmed in front of a live studio audience will add in canned laughter for scenes where they need it. What makes How I Met Your Mother's laugh track unique is that it uses canned laughter that is actually from a live audience and not one of these stock sounds. The audience was shown a screening of the episode instead of watching it be filmed like with Friends. The show couldn't be filmed live because of how frequently it relies on flashbacks and time jumps.
If you said goodbye to me tonight, there would still be music left to write. What else could I do? I'm so inspired by you. That hasn't happened for the longest time.
Because of this unique approach, they were able to get the benefits of having a live audience where the laughter does not all sound the same without the actors needing to pause after a joke. You'll notice, unlike most laugh tracks, How I Met Your Mother's usually plays during or at the end of a joke and overlaps with the next character's spoken lines.
The bottom half of his face is smiling. Look, he seems happy. Seems like a nice guy. But the top half of his face wants to murder you. Cheerful. Wants to murder you. No, cheerful. Wants to murder you.
And you'll notice there wasn't this long drawn out pause between the joke and the next line that is kind of required when you have a live audience. And because of this lack of pausing and the audience being recorded separately, they play the laugh track at a much lower volume. This is probably the biggest thing that people tend to notice about How I Met Your Mother's laugh track compared to other sitcoms. Sometimes the laughs are just like a quiet chuckle while the actor's still talking.
And this locket was my grandma's. She kept it hidden in her butt all through World War II. What? Where was she? Winnipeg?
The creators have said something they love about this is that most shows with a live audience either need to put inauthentic sounding stock laughter if the audience didn't give a good reaction, or they have to rely on easy humor punchlines to make the audience laugh. And very often there are live rewrites and unscripted elements that get put in because of the audience's reaction.
I'm going to say this for the last time. Would you please just...
How I Met Your Mother didn't have to do that, which allowed the story to be told in a very specific way, which is beneficial for our purposes, making it easier to analyze this show's story and characters because the continuity is really solid when compared to other sitcoms with a laugh track that have gone on for 9 seasons.
6 years earlier, a few weeks after their wedding, Marshall and Lily were going through their wedding gifts.
Well, that's weird. Did Ted get us anything?
Known your Aunt Robin for 8 years at that point, and here's what we knew about her mom.
My mom got stung by a jellyfish. Oh, it's my mom. She's going through some pretty major league health stuff. God, why won't that guy call? Wait a minute. You want him to call?
That mostly consistent continuity is there in part because it didn't have these sort of changes that come about from filming live. None of that is to say How I Met Your Mother is necessarily better than other sitcoms with a laugh track, or that those sitcoms can't also be used for media studies education. It's just that these elements help the story and characters to be more cohesive, and creates an extra layer of how the laugh track is useful in discussing this show. And in my personal opinion, I do think How I Met Your Mother's subtler laugh track makes it a lot easier to forget that it's there.
Listen to the stories the stones are telling you. And pick up my dry cleaning.
I will. Thank you so much, Mr. Mosby.
Hey, Ted. This table just told me you're a douche.
So it still gains the psychological benefits of having a laugh track in that hearing people laugh makes you more likely to laugh, while not deterring as many people who would normally not watch the show because of the laugh track. Although there's still some people who won't watch it because even at this level, it's too much for them.
Okay, think of any 2 words other than small or penis. Got it. Small penis. Damn it!
So something I will always appreciate about sitcoms that were filmed live is watching the other actors trying not to laugh. Like, this sometimes happens in other shows, but it's so common in shows that were filmed live because they can only use so many takes. And they are also being affected by hearing other people laugh. It's probably the most entertaining part of audience laughter in a show.
Well, it Monica's
Usually I just lean into their ear and whisper this one thing.
Jesus Christ. A lot of people were disappointed with the ending of How I Met Your Mother, and before we really dive into it, we should talk about some of the production issues that contributed to this disappointment, starting with Jason Siegel.
Seriously, does my eyeliner look okay?
Now, if you don't already know this story, you may be surprised to hear his name mentioned, since Marshall and Lily aren't usually brought up when people talk about the problems with the finale. Their story goes pretty much exactly how we expected it to. Their family continues to grow, and Marshall's career takes off, which we had already been told for seasons that was going to happen through flash forwards. But it was Marshall's actor, not the character, that contributed to some of the problems with the ending. When looking at the final season as a whole, and not just the finale, you'll notice Marshall is missing from a lot of it. For the whole first half of the season, he's separated from the rest of the group on a road trip with a new character named Daphne.
Marshall, when you talk, I feel shut up.
And even when he finally joins the rest of the cast at the end, he's still missing from a lot of scenes. This is because a lot of Jason Siegel's scenes were rushed and filmed separately from the rest of the cast. And they did this to accommodate Siegel's filming schedule for this movie with Cameron Diaz, because that was the only way they were even able to have him for this final season. You see, the main cast all signed a contract that ended after season 8, and these 4 were willing to come back, but Jason Siegel was not. He had been kind of breaking out into movie roles and was done with being on this show. But obviously, with the way this story is told, they can't just write him off, off, so they had to beg him to stay and then accommodate him accordingly. And while there are a lot of interesting aspects to the final season, this caused some of the writing to be hindered and rushed, and I think most importantly to the ending, really contributed to a pacing problem. A lot of issues with the finale are caused because of how fast it goes, especially when compared to the rest of the show. Like, a lot of the revelations aren't that bad over the course of 17 years, but we are watching it over the course of a few minutes. For a lot of people, it feels like a character assassination for everyone except for Lily and Marshall. Kind of a literal character assassination for one of them. This wouldn't be as much of a problem if there was better pacing in the 9th season, or if there had been a 10th season like there had been talks of before Jason Siegel was like, I'm not even doing the 9th. And they could have had more time to think about what direction they wanted to go in instead of falling back on the finale they already had planned for years, which I'll talk more about in part 2. But I think the biggest issue with the finale is the 9th season leading up to it, which feels really disconnected. And in the same way, the finale ruins the 9th season for a lot of people, to the point where some people pretend the whole season doesn't exist. Even though there are a lot of really good aspects to it, particularly in terms of continuity and poetics. Like, there's an episode almost entirely in verse, which is really interesting for a show to do. That episode is also a perfect example of what went wrong in regards to Jason Siegel and the writing of the show. The episode has Marshall and Lin-Manuel Miranda as his bus buddy.
Rhyme. Thinking.
I've just been handed a news flash. The word Canada is unrhymable. It's easier to, I don't know, get drunk and try to climbable. But Canada, damn it, ask any man on the planet and watch his stammer and stamina as they clamor and cram it into the middle of a sentence. First shot at repentance. Pass the problem on to all their non-rhyming descendants. I've never met anyone who could clean up after Canada, except my Uncle Tony from the Bronx. He's a janitor.
Telling rhyming stories to his infant son of some random wacky things that the rest of his friends did.
Am I king? Glad you asked.
We didn't.
Never do.
It's origin story time. And trust me, every word is true.
And again, that's really interesting for a show to do, but the green screen is really noticeable. Marshall is missing from most of these stories he's telling about his friends, and none of them really mean anything. Within the episode itself, we get one of the interesting visual storytelling moments that are very common on this show. The story about Ted has him go on a date with a girl, but then not want to have a second one because he finds out she had already slept with Barney. And then later, the story about Barney has him wake up next to that same girl. On its own, this would be a good episode to analyze, especially if it was in the early seasons, but it's not. It's in the one where the story needed to be paced better in preparation for the finale. When I talk about pacing, I'm not talking about like foreshadowing. The ending was very well foreshadowed throughout this season.
Yeah, of course she showed up. What mother is going to miss her daughter's wedding? Oh, hey. No. Come on.
It's okay, I'm fine. I'm okay.
And honestly, through a lot of the show. But the audience needs to be emotionally led there at a much slower pace than they were in the finale, and unfortunately, a big aspect to that pacing was because of Jason Siegel. And to be clear, this isn't meant to be like a dig at him or anything. He was just doing what he felt like was best for his career and personal growth. And we're still going to talk about the thematics and other big factor leading up to the finale, but I felt like this was a really important aspect to share. Also, one last poetically ironic fun fact to end this video on. Supposedly, in 2022, Siegel suggested doing a season 10 of the show, which unfortunately is 10 years too late, since if the show had had a 10th season when it was airing, the finale would have been laid out over a whole season, and that would have been a lot more digestible for people. It certainly would have been easier for most audiences to watch the characters change over the course of many episodes instead of just a few minutes in the finale. Even if those changes actually are supposed to be years apart and sometimes make complete sense, it doesn't feel that way to watch over the course of just a few minutes. There are three main issues people tend to have with the ending of How I Met Your Mother: the mother dying, Ted and Robin getting together, and Barney and Robin getting divorced. And today we're going to focus on the first two because they were how the show was always intended to end. You see, the scene in the finale where the kids talk about the mother already having passed away and Ted wanting to get with Robin now.
Come on, Dad. Mom's been gone for 6 years now. It's time.
Was actually filmed 7 years prior during season 2. Writers didn't know how long the show was going to go on for, but knew the kids would eventually look too old.
Sat us down to tell us the story of how you met our mother 8 years ago!
They filmed this scene way in advance, which had the unfortunate consequence of locking them into a specific ending if they want to use the kids. And taking out where the show actually ends up going, it makes a lot of sense that this was the original ending planned.
You totally have the hots for Aunt Robin.
Like, it creates an in-universe reason of why Ted would want to tell his kids this story, but also a literary connection to Love in the Time of Cholera, which is Ted's favorite book. Tim mentioning this as his favorite book in the first season is kind of our first hint of how the story is going to end. end, because the book is about this guy and girl who fall in love when they're young but can't be together / the girl doesn't want to at the time, and then the guy goes on to see other people and eventually get married, and then his wife dies and they reconnect and finally get together when they're older. Ted telling this story to his kids is creating his own retelling of his favorite book. It also creates this character arc for Ted where he deconstructs the concept of the one and parallels the mother doing her own deconstruction of this concept.
You know what comes after the one? The next one.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't really see that happening anytime soon.
When the mother was young, she had a boyfriend she was in love with who died, and she felt like that was the one, and she's never going to get another one.
I was in love with somebody a long time ago, and he died.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. It's silly, but it's like the first lottery ticket I ever bought was kaboom, jackpot, and I'm pretty sure I'm not going to win again. Not like that, anyway. So I don't generally buy lottery tickets anymore.
And we see her eventually go through the grieving process and allow herself to get over this concept and actually fall in love again with Ted.
I think that I have been holding myself back from falling in love again. And I think it's because I can't let you go. But you're not here anymore. So I have to ask this. Would it be okay if I moved on?
In a similar way, at the beginning of the show, Ted has this obsession with finding the one, and even sometimes rejects girls because he thinks that Robin is his the one. And Tracy is able to break this concept for him, both through him being able to fall in love with her despite his feelings for Robin, but also him going through the same grieving process. It's almost the same exact amount of years of her dying and him going after Robin as it was for Max dying and her eventually falling in love with Ted. He learns a lot about love and relationships throughout the series, but one of the most important he learns from the mother, which is breaking down this idea of what he thinks love is supposed to be. If we think about Ted in isolation, ignoring where all the other characters were going or should have ended up, this is a good ending for him in terms of themes, character development, and writing devices that they were using throughout the show. The problem then is considering what was sacrificed by the other characters in terms of growth, development, and themes in order to make Ted's work. If the show had ended in season 2 or even like season 4, this ending probably would have been fine. I mean, people still would have had an issue with being so heavily invested in finding out who the mother is only for her to die, but it wouldn't have had as huge of a backlash as it does. Barney changing his ways because he has a daughter makes perfect sense if he hasn't already worked past those issues through his relationships throughout the series. Robin having a successful career and finally being ready for a serious relationship makes perfect sense if she wasn't already doing that in season 9 with Barney. People probably would have been more comfortable with the mother dying if it hadn't been so long waiting for her and then spending a whole season getting to know her. The thing is, from the kids' perspective, the story still makes perfect sense. They already know that their mother has passed away. They already know that Barney and Robin are divorced, or at the very least are not together now. But the problem is how this felt for the audience and how it seems to jumble up the direction that they were going in. Throughout the last season, Barney and Robin face challenges that question how viable their relationship is, and each time they come out stronger as a couple, having worked through those problems. And in the end, what breaks them up has nothing to do with any of the problems that were brought up throughout that season, or even that were brought up when they dated before in a previous season. They basically broke up because Robin is working too much and having them travel all around because of her work, and that doesn't work with Barney wanting to be home and running a blog, and it's just a circumstantial situation that is causing a lot of understandable frustration in their relationship. Like, it's not unrealistic for them to break up because of this, it just doesn't really fit with everything else that we've been seeing. And them ending up together already made sense in terms of their character development. Like, they helped each other become better people and more self-actualized.
For a long time, deep down, I felt sort of broken, but I don't feel that way anymore. Robin, along with the idea that vengeance will soon be mine, has made me 100% awesome.
They both have a lot of baggage in terms of relationships, and they help each other through that. And I think the alternate ending, leaving their relationship in an ambiguous place, is kind of a stronger ending for them than anything that could have happened. And that's the thing with the alternate ending. It's not that it's necessarily better, it's that it goes in a direction that people were kind of expecting these characters to go in, and that their growth and development seem to lean towards. But I wouldn't necessarily call it a better ending, especially because it doesn't have the kids talking in it, and that's a really important, like, bookend to the story. If we look at How I Met Your Mother as a sort of literary piece, I think the original ending has a lot more going for it in terms of, like, poetics and symbolism and, like, what the story is actually trying to say. And sure, we can say it diminishes some of the aspects it had been saying throughout the previous few seasons, especially when it comes to characters that aren't Ted. Even Lily's career is not mentioned in the finale at all, even though that was such an important part of her arc, and, like, trying to get over this idea that she let go of all of these dreams when she chose to be a wife and a mother. And the alternate ending still doesn't fix all of those problems. It just provides a bit more satisfaction in terms of entertainment because it doesn't have those three big things that are so jarring for people. And I think in this regard, there was kind of no way to have a satisfying ending, especially because the kids had already been filmed, like, 7 seasons before. For a show that uses so many interesting writing techniques and references to various literature, it makes sense that they wanted to go with an ending that included the kids and had, like, a thematic conclusion to everything that Ted was going through. But unfortunately, that had them stuck with what they planned on having the kids say in season 2. It all kind of comes back to production problems, whether it's the pacing because of Jason Siegel or being locked into a specific ending because of the kids. There are genuinely good things about the ending that I think kind of get overshadowed by these problems. Like it paralleling Love in the Time of Cholera is really interesting. But unfortunately, pre-planning the ending locked them into something that just didn't make as much sense anymore. And this also could have been solved if we had more time and it had been paced better, because what is happening is much more significant than where it ends up. That's kind of a big part of the finale and the show in general, that things are still important just because they happened, even when it has to come to an end. On a personal level, while I understand why it upsets people so much, I do think it's not quite as bad as people tend to make it out to be, and there's a lot of interesting things we can take away from it and talk about, and I honestly kind of love the actual final scene. No matter what the actual goal was, How I Met Your Mother was always about the journey. It was never just about the mother or even Robin. It was about the life lessons that Ted and his friends learned and what it means to tell a story. And that moment that he brought Robin the blue French horn in the first episode isn't just some romantic gesture, it's the beginning of this connection that led to everything. You see Robin start to smile and cry in those final moments. It doesn't feel like it's just about Ted. It's about this entire show that we've just watched. It's about all of these experiences that they've had together, that all of them have had together. I understand why not everyone likes it, but to me, those last few moments are the definition of legend, wait for it. There are a few deleted scenes to the finale of How I Met Your Mother, but there's one in particular that people feel really should have been included, including Josh Radnor, because it shows that Tracy was not just a baby maker for Ted. He genuinely loved her over Robin. And it shows more of Robin's perspective and kind of contextualizes that a lot happens off screen. I'm sorry for the shirt change again, but it also gives a sort of life update for Robin and explains why she's back in New York now. Now I'm going to show it in full at the end of this video, but if you want a deeper analysis of the ending, I recommend watching the video this comment comes from. I don't think this would fix the ending for everyone, but it might for some people, and I think at the very least it will lead to some interesting discussion.
Hey, we should get lunch sometime. I'm my own boss now, so I have plenty of time to
drag your poor daughter in the city to brag about past career triumphs?
Pretty much, yeah. Hey, you like Daddy's stories, right?
How'd you and Mommy meet?
I'll tell you later. You got gored by a bull?
I got gored by a bull. I was in Spain, and we were shooting this segment on bullfighting. My producer thought it would be super cute if I got into the ring and tried it.
No.
Spoilers, I got gored by a bull.
You got gored by a bull.
Gored by a bull. So after that, I decided I'm just gonna do some anchor work at the studio, stay put a while. I even adopted 5 new dogs.
5? Why is it always 5 with you?
1 dog's for wimps. That's practically a cat.
So, now that you're in the city full time, we'll see more of you?
Yeah.
Good. Because it's all just going by so fast.
I know. I think about that all the time.
I mean, I think about all the memories all those nights at McLaren's. I mean, how did we end up here, you know?
I am so glad you said that. I feel that way too. I mean, I'm happy with my life. Got my face on a bus, but does anyone ever get to this age and not wonder what could be different? Remember we had that deal? If we're both still single when we're 40? I guess I should wish that I made that deal with someone else. But I don't. You were my best friend, Ted. You were more than that, and I miss you. And I've been feeling crazy for thinking about it, but now that I know that you feel the same way too, I don't feel crazy anymore.
I meant, how did we end up here at this restaurant instead of McLaren's?
Wow. Sorry.
No. It's...
You're really happy, aren't you?
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm still the overthinkingest person ever. Most overthinking? Biggest overthinker? Well, that is going to keep me up tonight. But, I don't spend a lot of time thinking, what if? I guess that's happiness. Not that I'm telling you what happiness is. I'm just saying, for me, it's...
I'm happy too. I am.
Good. I'm really glad you're happy. Oh, I am so sorry. I gotta pick up the kids.
Oh.
Did this get weird?
Oh, no. Go ahead. I'll take care of this. It was really great to see you.
Yeah, you too. You're okay, right?
I'm fine. No major problems. Major problems?
The characters on How I Met Your Mother are selfish and flawed to a comical degree, as is basically every character from any sitcom ever that's part of the genre.
Judge all you want to, but married a lesbian, left a man at the altar, fell in love with a gay ice dancer, threw a girl's wooden leg in the fire, live in a box!
Most sitcoms, including How I Met Your Mother, will not just imply, but explicitly point out the flaws in their characters.
All the most codependent, incestuous, controlling group of people I've ever met!
Calling out the bad behavior of the main cast.
What are you doing right now?
Oh, God, no.
Awesome. Okay, I'll see you in like 10 minutes. Great. Sorry, Henrietta. Something came up. Take a rain check, pal?
Yeah, it's no problem.
All right.
Oh, you're strong.
What a jerk.
Even doing it as early as season 1.
And there you have it, kids. The stupidest thing I've ever done. In one night, I managed to hurt 2 people I cared about. And none of it would have happened if I had just listened to my mom.
Much of the humor in sitcoms is derived from over-exaggerated, flawed characters engaging in inappropriate behavior for the slice-of-life setting that they're in.
I have to go refill. I'll be back in a moment. Play's not over.
I never get picked for audience participation.
And sure, there are also good parts that allow us to empathize with these characters. They're not all bad people, but that's part of the point. It's not black and white. They're not all good or all bad. At times, Barney is awful to his friends. He pulls pranks on them that are really mean-spirited.
I met someone up on this roof 4 years ago, and they mixed that cocktail, and they loved penguins. By any chance, was that you? It's you. I was crazy, but I can't.
You are such a loser.
At the same time, he'll go out of his way to do incredible things for them if they're down or need help.
Lily, you have to come home. You and Marshall belong together. The two of you have something that most people search their whole lives for and never find. I know you love him, and if you knew what he was going through right now, you wouldn't be here for one more second. I bought you a ticket home. Marshall is one of the best people I know, and it won't be long until someone else realizes that, and you'll lose him forever. I can't stand the thought of that happening, and I cannot keep stealing chicks from him forever. Never, ever tell anyone I was here. I will deny it tooth and nail. This trip never happened.
We as the audience are able to recognize both of these traits without needing to worry about whether or not we would actually be friends with him in real life because he's not real. It's perfectly valid to hate Barney or any of these characters. You don't have to like them. It's also important to acknowledge that their flaws are part of the show. They're often at an extreme degree that we would not accept from people in real life. That's, again, part of the genre of a sitcom. All 5 of these characters, even Marshall, at some point engage in behavior that we would not find acceptable in real life, and we are supposed to understand that as we're watching it. We can even enjoy these characters while acknowledging that their behavior would not be okay if they were real. To be clear, that's not to say that we can't be critical of the show or that it's not without faults as a whole. And we can even be critical of some fans while acknowledging that people are watching this and other shows for a variety of reasons. Like, personally, I've watched the show many times, but I don't really have too strong of an opinion on any of the characters because I tend to watch shows with a more academic and distanced mindset because that's entertaining to me. But someone else who watches this might love watching it for Barney because they find him to be wacky and zany and fun, while understanding that much of his behavior is not good and they would hate him in real life. Or someone might love him because they remind him of someone they hate in real life and it feels cathartic to watch him. Or they hate watching him for that reason and they can't stand when he's on screen. All of these ways of engaging with this piece of media are perfectly valid and how most people are engaging with sitcoms in general because, again, it's the genre. And there are some great shows that deconstruct the genre, like Kevin Kneff himself.
It's about a woman who keeps playing perfect housewife.
Hey, where's our breakfast? You're not supposed to have favorites.
Kevin's my husband.
Yeah, babe, can you go see if my package is here yet?
Can't you do it?
I'm in the middle of something.
Then one day, she realizes what she wants.
Whoa, Miss Hercules over here.
Is that blood? It doesn't mean you get to be moody. You already used that excuse once this month.
Which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it, but it's really delving into this idea of like how awful sitcom characters would be if they were real. And also a deeper look at husband-wife sitcoms. I wrote about it in my thesis, so y'all should check it out. But the point is, we can have like these interesting and good discussions about how sitcom characters are like not good people in real life. Understanding that that's by design and it's okay that that's not going to be a hindrance from people watching sitcoms. In fact, it is exactly what makes them entertaining and why so many sitcoms are willing to acknowledge that within their own shows.
Oh, hi, Rose. The ceiling in your room leaking too? No, Dorothy, I just finished milking the cow I keep in my closet. Gee, with only 3 hours sleep, I can be as bitchy as you.
I think for some people, when they notice these selfish behaviors, they feel like they've caught on to something that the show does not know. Perhaps because it's common in children's shows to have characters that only have like slight flaws and are very explicit about working on them throughout the show. Even then, there are plenty that show this level of like human moral complexity. It's just that the characters here are only going to work on certain flaws, not all of them. They're always going to have some level of over-the-top, over-exaggerated personality trait. Not every sitcom is as focused on developing their characters and story as much as this one is, but even here, they're never going to be perfect people, and that's okay. Not all main characters are meant to be role models, even if they are trying to say deeper things at times. Those deeper things are not always, this character is perfect and how you should act. And again, you still don't have to like the show while understanding and acknowledging that. While working on this video, my boyfriend told me about the ending of Seinfeld, which is controversial, but I think kind of perfectly encapsulates this idea that sitcom characters are awful and that's part of the show. The main cast are on trial for criminal negligence because they witness a crime and don't do anything about it. And the prosecution brings in everyone these people have wronged throughout the series. If sitcom characters were real, this is the reaction most of them would get.
And how do you find with respect to the charge of criminal indifference?
We find the defendants guilty.
Room. I do not know how or under what circumstances the four of you found each other. But your callous indifference and utter disregard for everything that is good and decent has rocked the very foundation upon which our society is built.
That is okay, because these shows are not trying to teach us how to be good people. Even when they're saying something grander, it is not about how to be a moral person. Many times, these characters can still be likable and even lovable, even with these over-the-top, unrealistic flaws. But again, if you don't like them, that's also okay. It's a matter of opinion. It doesn't mean that they're poorly written in an objective sense. Of course, they can also be poorly written, but them being immoral is not what makes them so. Somebody is going to bring up It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia as an example, and it is a great example.
Holy shit!
Whoa, you kidnapped Gorman?
I don't really know what happened, okay? First I was angry, then I was drinking. Next thing I know, I'm following this guy home and forcing him into the trunk of his own car.
People tend to have this opinion that them being awful is exceptional, that it's unique about that show. And the main cast certainly do have far less redeeming qualities than a lot of other sitcoms. There are very few moments where we feel compelled by them, unlike How I Met Your Mother. They're simply an extreme example, not an exception, because again, pretty much all sitcoms are about selfish people. How I Met Your Mother episode How Lily Stole Christmas features Ted calling Lily a Grinch.
You gotta get over that Grinch.
But I didn't say Grinch. I said a bad word. A very, very bad word.
Oh, fudge.
But I didn't say fudge.
Here he is replacing a swear word to make a very direct reference to A Christmas Story.
Oh, fudge.
Only I didn't say fudge. I said the word. The big one. The queen mother of dirty words. The F-dash-dash-dash word.
But there's a bit of disagreement on which swear Lily is actually saying. Her initial reaction might be to think she means bitch, but a lot of people have come to the conclusion that she must have meant cunt because they use the word bitch throughout the series. It does make sense since cunt would be seen as worse to an American audience in 2005. However, I think there's actually a pretty strong argument for it being the word bitch, and it all kind of boils down to the approach that you take in your interpretation. As good as this show is in terms of continuity, it's fairly inconsistent in what Ted's comfortable saying around his kids. For example, in this episode, he uses the word weed, even though elsewhere we see him using sandwiches to mean weed. A good comparison to the Grinch thing would be the episode where he uses the term playing the bagpipes to replace the word fuck. Textually, he's doing this to avoid directly talking about sex to his kids, even though he talks about sex in basically every other episode to them. In both cases, we can think of the bagpipes and the Grinch thing as not being for the kids, but for the audience watching the show. And you might be thinking, oh, well, they couldn't get away with saying the word fuck, that's why they used the word bagpipes there, but they could definitely get away with saying the word bitch. After all, they do it a bunch later in the show.
Son of a bitch!
But just because they can use it later in a joking manner, usually while Lily is putting on a voice, doesn't mean they could have gotten away with using it here. Not only is the point that Ted is not saying it in a kind of silly, like, acceptable way, but also it is said so many times in this episode.
Mom, what's a Grinch? Grinch! 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 Grinch!
Merry Christmas, everybody!
Grinch! 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 Grinch!
The FCC regulates the use of swears in shows based off a lot of factors, including when and where it's airing, in what context, and how many times it's being used. And not only is the show going to be much more afraid of FCC complaints in season 2 than it would in, like, season 6 when Lily is regularly saying, "You son of a bitch."
You son of a bitch!
But the context and frequency that Grinch is being used in this episode would not be acceptable at any time in the show's history using either of these words. Bitch is also going to be taken much differently coming from a straight man than it's going to be taken coming from, like, Lily later.
You son of a bitch.
There's also the case of people reacting really extremely to the word in the episode, which I still think fits for either. Like, there are 5 pieces to this. Lily's reaction, which is understandable for either of these. She's just going to be upset about being called that. Either of these also work for Ted's super religious cousin and his mother. The only 2 reactions that I think lean a bit more towards cunt is the random woman who was offended when she heard it.
Why'd you say it now?
Grinch.
And the super that lived above Lily that was also offended. But I don't think it's unrealistic in 2005 for a woman to get offended if someone just randomly says bitch, presumably even possibly about her. The super shuts off Lily's lights because Ted's swearing a lot. All that is to say, It really could be either word, and logistically there are some aspects that seem to lean more towards cunt, but rhetorically there's some aspects that seem to lean more towards it being bitch. Firstly, your mind already is trying to fill in the word as bitch because of the context and similar sound. It seems to give like a similar psychological effect to a malapropism or a parapostokian. If you don't know, both of these are humorous rhetorical devices. A malapropism is basically when you accidentally use a similar sounding word in place of what you meant. And a paraprostokian is when what you say is against like the expectations of where the sentence or phrase was going, and it causes you to like reevaluate what was being said altogether. Of course, it's not actually either of those things. It's just giving a similar psychological effect where you have a specific word in mind that you're associating it with. In reality, it's simply a pun that plays off of both A Christmas Story and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which is also where we get the title of the episode. But even through being a pun, it would make sense to be bitch, since fudge is being used specifically because of how similar it sounds to the swear that it's supposed to be. And Grinch certainly sounds more like bitch than the alternative. Although I personally tend to prioritize the more poetic and punny interpretation when it's available, and this is one of those situations where multiple interpretations are valid. And in that way, it could actually be neither. It could be a word that no one's even thought of. All we know definitively is that Ted didn't say Grinch. The rest is up for us to decide. Although for me, just discussing the possibility of what could have been said is more interesting than whatever it actually was. So How I Met Your Mother ended the way it was always intended to. However, early on, there were 2 backup mothers in case the show got canceled prematurely.
Tonight, we will make a memory that will never be tarnished.
First is Victoria, and we actually got the episode where she would have been the mother if the show had ended early.
The best part of any first kiss is the lead up to it. The moment right before the lips touch. It's like a big drum roll. So how about tonight we just stick with the drum roll?
Originally, How I Met Your Mother was only greenlit for 13 episodes, and while they had a larger plan for the story, they made sure that that 13th episode could have been a satisfying finale if it had to be. Ted makes eye contact with Victoria at the very end of episode 12, and the entirety of episode 13, drumroll please, is about their meeting. In perfect How I Met Your Mother fashion, we jump between the present and the past to find out what happened that night he spent with Victoria, as we follow Ted the next day trying to find out who she was because he didn't know her last name and there was no Victoria invited to the wedding. And it's an incredibly romantic episode with so much tension, and there's so many interesting things about this moment with Victoria that he talks about. And the fact that it ends in her bakery kissing after he finds out that she made the cake, and she says, "Thank God," when she sees him. However you feel, whatever it takes. It touches on some of the themes that are going to become very important to Ted and Victoria's relationship as the show goes on, while at the same time allowing for this to be a potential ending of the story that is satisfying. There aren't many questions left for us. Interestingly, if it had ended this way though, the moment that Ted has in the car right before he runs into the bakery would have been so different.
Into our dying days, we'll remember everything about that night as perfect. Maybe we both need that. I mean, so many things go wrong in life, but this is the one thing that never will. It will always be pure, unadulterated awesome.
Because either way, Ted is wrong, because this is important to him meeting the mother, whether the mother is Victoria or Tracy. In the current reality, he's wrong because it's important to take a chance, whereas if Victoria had been the mother, then he'd be wrong because she would have been the one that got away. We could have a whole discussion on just episode 13. It is probably the most interesting of season 1, in my opinion.
I'm gonna go home tonight with a lot of great memories and one really sucky memory. The memory of you walking out that door.
Hey, Ted.
Yeah.
Close your eyes and count to 5.
1, 2, 3, 4,
you say goodbye. I watch you walk away beside the lucky guy.
We also kind of would have had a conclusion with Robin. She was willing to let him go and chase off after Victoria despite having feelings for him. If this had been the final episode, then it would have been like her coming to terms with the fact that she was never going to be with him, in a similar way to how Ted comes to terms with the fact that he's never going to be with Robin, you know, before the finale. Now, I said there were 2 backup mothers, but Victoria was the only like real planned one that the creators have confirmed this is how the story would have ended if they had to. The other one is more incidental. At the end of season 3, Ted proposes to Stella.
Will you marry me?
And theoretically, she could have been the mother if the show had been canceled at that point. It wasn't like Victoria where it was all planned out super well. It's more like there was just enough ambiguity that if for some reason the show got canceled early, then it would have been fine. I think this gets talked about a bit more within like fan circles because it was something that was a real possibility at the time that it was airing. And I knew somebody was going to bring it up if I didn't mention it here, but after season 4, there's never this opportunity again where there's like a potential could have been the mother situation. The end of the first 13 episodes, which were kind of their own season, and the end of season 3 are the only times where there could have been another mother. But only Victoria was really planned out that way, and in both cases, it would have been on the off chance that the show got canceled. It was never intended to end with either of those. Yeah, this is something people have asked me about a few times, so I hope this clears it up a bit. Fun fact, How I Met Your Mother's Barney is obsessed with the numbers 8, 3, and most significantly, 83.
It's a well-known statistic that 83% of people married longer than 6 months are seeing someone on the side.
Do you know that when you make up a statistic, you always use 83%?
This is fairly consistent throughout the series. Now, not every fake statistic actually uses this number, just most of them do, about 83%.
Never in the history of New York City nightclubs has there been a shortage of dudes. Not even during the great dude shortage of 1883.
Now, it's not just fake examples. Some uses of the number 83 are based in reality.
Bros Life magazine. Page 83. Check it.
One of which is this statistic where Marshall says he only ends up succeeding in getting with girls less than 1% of the time that he tries.
If he's betted 199 of them, that is a success rate of a little over 1%.
The Real World Playbook and Bro Code also both reference the number 83 multiple times.
Rule number 83. If anything that comes out of that baby gets on one of my suits, I get to touch Lily's boobs.
You might be wondering why. Why is Barney so obsessed with this number?
Robin and I have been keeping a tally of how many beds we've done it in. We're up to 83 and a half.
Most likely it's because 1983 was the year his father, who he knew as his Uncle Jerry, left him.
Barney, afraid this is goodbye.
He would not see Jerry or Jerome again until Barney was an adult and tracked him down. Anyone who watches the show knows a lot of the bad things Barney does are caused because of his daddy issues.
How old are you? 83.
Or from his girlfriend Shannon leaving him in 1998. Now, why the writers chose this number is unclear, and if anybody wants to speculate in the comments, feel free to.
You know how long it takes a woman to decide whether or not she's going to sleep with a guy? 8.3 seconds.
But one kind of funny, silly possible reason is that if you round 83% of 83, you get 69.
Science! There is an 83% correlation between the times men wear boutonnieres and the times they get laid.
Which perhaps is a bit more fitting of a number for Barney.
You see, my legendary success rate of 83%.
17, it's always the inverse.
In season 1 of How I Met Your Mother, there's a scene that hints at the mother's name being Tracy.
I'm Amber.
I'm Ted.
Actually, I'm Tracy.
Still Ted.
And that, kids, is the true story of How I Met Your Mother.
What?
I'm kidding.
Weirdly enough, I think this scene gives us a perfect opportunity to learn about a sort of presentism and misunderstanding or misremembering production based off how a show ends. Because a lot of people in the comments of this video were confused that the creators planned for Victoria to be the backup mother if the show didn't make it past 13 episodes. Because they seem to think this scene fully established that the mother's name was Tracy, to the point where they seem to think if Ted married someone with any other name, it would have been a huge plot hole. But that's simply not the case. This is an example of the show foreshadowing foreshadowing the mother's name because that does end up being it. But at the time, it was just hinting at the name, not establishing it. The most likely scenario, and what ended up being the case, is that the kids believed Ted and were shocked because this was their mother's name. But if the mother hadn't been named Tracy, the kids still would have been shocked to hear that their mother was a stripper. The joke just wouldn't have been as good. Although that itself could have been the reason they were confused. It really could have went any way, even though it ended up being foreshadowing. But as the show was airing in 2005, people didn't consider this scene to establish the mother's name. It simply hinted at it. But this is where a sort of presentism comes in by misremembering based off the ending. If you don't know, presentism is this term that's usually used in history where we misunderstand history based off our present-day views. For example, a while ago there was a controversy about the song Baby It's Cold Outside coming across as creepy to people nowadays, especially with lyrics like "What's in this drink?" seeming to imply that he put something in her drink that might knock her out or something, even though that drug wouldn't be invented until 20 years after the song came out. In general, the style of communicating in the song is different than how we do today, which causes us to misinterpret it. And I used a media example because we're discussing a piece of media here, but just know that this is common, like, as a problem throughout all kinds of interpreting history. Now, like I said, there's a sort of presentism happening here also, where we're misunderstanding what it was like in 2005 at the beginning of the show, based off how it ends in 2013. And I imagine even more so now that there's been further distance from the show as a whole. This is a very cool piece of foreshadowing, and there's a lot of interesting things we can say about it, like how it contextualizes part of the show was always planned to be the way that it was, at least certain elements of it, like the mother's name. But we should be cautious about misunderstanding and overinflating the role that this scene has, because we don't want it to affect our understanding of how people responded to the show at the time or what the production plans were. At least in this case, in regards to the backup production plans, like what would have happened if it had been canceled. Anyways, the point is that yes, the scene shows us that they wanted the mother's name to be Tracy, and like I said at the beginning of the other video, the show got to end the way they wanted it to. But this wouldn't have created a plot hole if the show changed because it got canceled early. So I wanted to make a few more videos on The Good Place before talking about this, but I've been rewatching it recently and I can't help myself. I need to talk about some weird connections that I've noticed between these two shows. These are things I noticed like 5 years ago but didn't have a TikTok audience to ramble to. Some of what I'm talking about is just going to be genre choices that happen to align between these two shows, but some of them are also weirdly specific. And I know this is going to be a strange video. Obviously, these two shows are in very different realms, and I have not done a lot of groundwork to prep you guys for me talking about these shows at the same time, other than them being sitcoms with purposely imperfect characters. But oh well, we're going to get into it because I just can't stop seeing some intertextual connections that are just divided through various layers of text. I'm not even going to get into how, like, slightly similar these two images look, at least in terms of like aesthetics, because I chose these images at random. This was not on purpose. But the marketing of both of these shows having a lot of like sky/clouds and yellow inside of them, it's just interesting, although very different reasons between them, which we will see as a pattern of the stuff I'm going to talk about. Now, obviously, there's some superficial connections. Like I said, they're both sitcoms with purposely imperfect characters. They also both use flashbacks and time manipulation as like key storytelling devices, including like ones that have like big fantasy elements to them, although those fantasy elements are real in The Good Place, whereas in How I Met Your Mother, they're just imagined. They also both have a female character in the main cast who's only romantically interested in a male character in the main cast, but shows a lot of sexual interest in other women, including another one of the main characters and also other women. And in both cases, while this attraction is not ignored by the other characters, it is fully acknowledged. It also is being used primarily for humor. Although in Eleanor's case, she seems to be a fully bisexual character. She's just only romantically attracted to Chidi throughout the series, whereas Lily is more bi-curious. And that curiosity, while it comes up quite frequently throughout the show, kind of gets fumbled in the final season. They also both, while originally being American sitcoms in English, are inspired by non-American, non-English literature from the 20th century. While not being a complete retelling, they diverge quite a bit from what you might think of as their source material. For How I Met Your Mother, this is Love in the Time of Cholera by Colombian novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez that was originally in Spanish. And for The Good Place, this is No Exit by the French playwright Jean-Paul Sartre, which not only serves as the basis for season 1's plot, although although with the twist that it's unknown to the characters, but also is directly referenced in at least seasons 1 and 4, perhaps the rest of the show as well. Just as Love in the Time of Cholera is both directly and indirectly referenced throughout all of How I Met Your Mother, including the beginning and end. Okay, so all of that is like conceptual, but there's also some like concrete, weird connections that are noticeable. One of the most obvious probably being the red cowboy boots. In both cases, the character who has them is a professor who thinks they look good on him, whereas everyone else doesn't. And they come up multiple times. It's not just a single episode thing, even though it seems like it's gonna be in both cases, while still not being like super significant. It just comes up more than once. So probably most interestingly, but incredibly wild to be bringing up at all, there is this picture. Bro code, which Barney became like a real world symbol for and really helped popularize in some way, is on this list above the number 83, which Barney is also obsessed with. And here's the thing. I have a master's degree in literature. I continue to read critical theory all the time. I'm constantly talking about media studies and have seen both of these shows multiple times. I've made a bunch of videos about How I Met Your Mother already, and at least one so far about The Good Place. And I'm sure if I think hard enough, I could make a reasonable statement about the aesthetic connections between these shows and like the different symbolism and whatnot, probably coming up with some kind of metatextual reason for why it's happening. Like, as I said earlier, there's clearly some level of intertextuality happening here. Perhaps there are certain aspects that are just not that strange to have on TV, but it's noticeable because these shows are so starkly different in like what they're about conceptually. Some aspects are so specific, and I like my brain has fried every time that I've watched The Good Place and been like, wow, that's a weird thing that reminds me of How I Met Your Mother. And that happens when you study media. That's part of the point. Everything's connected. But before I can even like collect my thoughts about it and have a real reasonable conclusion for this, I needed to get this out here because nobody was talking about it. At least no one I saw was talking about it, and I felt like I was going crazy every time that I watched The Good Place and I see a random connection to How I Met Your Mother. I needed to get it out there. So now you guys can have thoughts about it the way that I've been thinking about it. Let me know in the comments if I'm crazy, because I know this is a different video than the usual one that I make. I needed to talk about it. I've had this held inside for so many years now, and I had to let it out. How I Met Your Father has some moments that seem to directly hint at Sid being the father, and a lot of people think he was going to be the father. It's probably the most popular theory. Ironically, I think part of this is because he's the least obvious choice at the beginning since he gets engaged in the pilot. And 3 of the 5 candidates for who the father might be already tried to pursue a romantic relationship with Sophie in season 1, and Sid isn't one of them. We know the writers of this show love to subvert expectations, so him being the father in some ways becomes the most obvious choice. And that could actually debatably have made it less likely to happen because so many people were expecting it to be him because we weren't supposed to expect it to be him. However, I too think it probably would have been Sid, mostly because it would have been the poetic choice. With the extensive amount of references and parallels that this show has to the original How I Met Your Mother, which we will be getting into, it would make a lot of sense to have Sid as the father. While the entire cast parallels various How I Met Your Mother characters throughout the run of the show, in some narrative ways, each of them fits an archetype of the original How I Met Your Mother cast, except for Sid. Sophie embodies the role of and subverts the personality of Ted. It's her story, and she starts with this hopeful romantic optimism in a similar way that Ted does. But she's not pretentious like Ted, she's more of a party person. Jesse is her Robin. They have this long, drawn-out will they, won't they storyline in which they start off as being attracted to each other, but then decide to just be friends, but then actually eventually get together. He also has a backstory of being a musician who's internet famous for something he finds embarrassing. And like Sophie, similarly subverts Robin by being romantic and saying I love you. Valentina and Charlie do something similar with Lily and Marshall, although switching who is Sophie's best friend because gender. She's bold, he's silly, and we know that they're endgame even though they're subverting the perfect romance that Lily and Marshall have. And Ellen is Barney, who seems to be separate from the rest of the cast and similarly outrageous and always trying to flirt with women, although in her case being incredibly unsuccessful. At least at first. Again, at times they match up with other characters and they're not these exact parallels, but especially in the first season, this seems to be like the setup of their dynamic. This leaves Sid as the sort of sixth character, just like the mother would end up being. If he did end up becoming the father, these loose archetype vibes would feel a lot more concrete, because his role would feel a lot more obvious in relation to the original show. Of course, that's just my opinion, and I'm not usually one to make these sort of opinion-based videos, instead trying to do more concrete analysis, and I do very much plan on doing that with this show as well. Since it's canceled and we don't know who the father was going to be, I felt like it's fine to do a little speculation video here and there. Let me know what you guys think. Who do you think the father was going to be, and what would you like to hear me talk about with this show? I have some plans currently, but I'd love to hear your suggestions. Okay, let's talk about the alternate ending, or what I like to call the Bob Saget ending.
That, kids, is How I Met Your Mother.
So if you don't know, the season 9 DVD of How I Met Your Mother came with an official alternate ending. But contrary to how people tend to talk about it, it's actually almost identical to the original. There are no new scenes or lines added except for future Ted, aka Bob Saget. It's really just a slightly different edit of the last few scenes. In fact, I mentioned how Barney and Robin's relationship is ambiguous in it, and that's only kind of true. The alternate ending picks up on this scene.
Hey, you kids.
Yeah, you didn't sound 1,000 there.
Do you have any idea what happened right here in this very bar?
No. What happened?
Just all kinds of stuff.
This scene is exactly the same as the original, there's no difference, and it takes place after Barney and Robin have already announced their divorce and Barney has already had a kid. Technically, there's nothing in this alternate ending that says anything about their relationship, so you can imagine whatever you want, but presumably they're still divorced.
Things fall apart, things get put back together.
Because again, there were no new scenes recorded for this ending. There's just the new stuff that future Ted says and a few scenes that were cut. They cut the part with the kids and Robin at the end, so it's just 3 scenes for this whole alternate ending. The first is them at the bar before Ted's wedding, which is exactly the same as the original. Then there's Ted's wedding and a kind of new sequence, but it's using old clips, and that's where we get a new voiceover. And then it's Ted meeting the mother, which again is exactly the same as it was in the original ending. So let's dive into that one part that changed. Throughout the entire series of How I Met Your Mother, future Ted was always voiced by Bob Saget instead of Josh Radnor. That's why future Ted's voice sounds different. However, during Ted's wedding is the first time where future Ted, the one talking to his kids, is Josh Radnor's voice. It's kind of prepping us for when we see him as future Ted later. During this sequence, he reminisces about the mother and talks about her dying, and they show her on her deathbed. But for the alternate ending, this is where everything changes. Bob Saget is once again the voice for future Ted during this, which is why I think of it as the Bob Saget ending. And instead of reminiscing about the mother, he confirms that the mother is still alive.
When I think how lucky I am to wake up next to your mom every morning, I can't help but be amazed at how easy it all really was.
And we see a montage recap of the series up until now, which we will get further into in a second, but this is the only visual change in the entire alternate ending, except for the end credit sequence is slightly different. They just kind of move around where different pictures were. And the end credit song is different, unfortunately. Now here's the thing, this alternate ending is a bit of a mixed bag. It was clearly not planned and has the unfortunate consequence of making some earlier scenes kind of confusing or melodramatic, like the end of The Travelers or Vesuvius. Basically, all of the scenes that foreshadowed the mother's death no longer make sense. It clearly only created this ending as an alternative to the mother dying and Ted getting with Robin, but because it was not planned for at all and there's no alternative scenes except for Bob Saget's voiceover, which again is just new, he didn't have any voice lines in the original, it unfortunately lacks a lot of cohesion with the rest of the story. I know a lot of people really like this ending because it fixes some of the problems they had with the show, but in my opinion they needed a lot of changes in order to keep with the aesthetics and themes of the show, with the exception of the recap sequence, which honestly could have been in the original and, while not perfect, is attempting to hone in on a very important theme of How I Met Your Mother. This is the show's idea of a butterfly or ripple effect. Every action leads to something else, which leads to something else, which ultimately ends up leading to where you are now. This is super exemplified in the episode Lucky Penny, where Robin and Ted are trying to trace back how they ended up being late to the airport. for it. And every time they think of the reason, they remember something that led to that reason, going all the way back to Ted finding a penny on the street. That's basically the whole story of Ted meeting Robin, eventually leading him to meet the mother. And yes, the kids correctly assume that part of the reason he's telling this story is because he's in love with Robin or whatever, but this is also an important theme of the show. And the alternate ending recap is specifically trying to showcase this theme like the Lucky Penny. And I think it's cool that it's doing that, although it doesn't do a great job of bringing it all together. Unlike the Lucky Penny, which is very explicit on how each of these events are directly connected to each other, what Ted says in this recap is kind of loosely connected. I think they did this to try and be more poetic, and if we know the show really well, we can still put together how each of these events led to each other, with the exception of Zoe and Victoria, which I think shouldn't have been in this recap. And in this alternate ending, they really should have been more explicit that this event led to this one, because essentially the point of this recap should be to explain why Ted is telling this story, if he's not telling it in order to explain that he wants to get with Robin. In this way, he's showing his kids the Lucky Penny ripple effect that happened from meeting Robin.
All I had to do was get out of the apartment for a couple hours so Uncle Marshall could propose to Aunt Lily. Go to the bar, meet your Aunt Robin, convince your Aunt Robin to fall in love with me, break up with your Aunt Robin, go on the rebound, go get a rebound tattoo, go get the rebound tattoo removed, meet Stella, convince Stella to fall in love with me, get engaged, get left at the altar, get fired, get beat up by a goat, get a job as a professor, teach the wrong class, date the wrong girl, date the wrong girl again, date the wrong girl a few times, actually. Let Uncle Barney fall in love with Aunt Robin. Let Aunt Robin fall in love with Uncle Barney. Book the wedding band. Go to their wedding. Make sure their wedding actually happened. Leave a little early. Be in the right place at the right time.
Them breaking up caused him to get a butterfly tattoo, which caused him to meet Stella when he got it removed. And when they broke up, her ex/new husband, Tony, is the one who got him the job as a professor. He met and dated the mother's old roommate, Cindy, who is the one that got the mother to play at Barney and Robin's wedding where Ted met the mother. Though honestly, if this had been the planned ending, it would have made more sense for him to start with how he met Barney. Not only is it also Barney's wedding at the end, but Barney is the one who introduced him to Robin. He may never have talked to her if it wasn't for him playing Have You Met Ted.
Hi, have you met Ted?
And of course, the story was never meant to be about how Barney caused Ted to meet the mother. It's about how Robin led Ted to meet the mother. I still think this recap does an interesting job at showing us how each of these events are connected. It just would have been a bit better if it was explicit and they hadn't included Zoe and Victoria, who have kind of nothing to do with this sequence of events. Sure, it was important for him to meet them in a life lesson sense, but it kind of takes away from this whole ripple effect that caused him to meet the mother, which is what makes this recap so interesting. Or would have if it was more explicitly doing that. In my opinion, that's probably the best part of the alternate ending, even though it's not perfect, because the rest of it kind of diminishes the story and writing more so than adding anything to it. And I completely understand some people want an ending where the mother doesn't die and Ted doesn't get with Robin, but I think they could have done it better than this. If they had more time and filmed more alternate scenes with this cast or with the kids. But as it stands, I think the original ending, while still not perfect, is doing a lot more and a lot better than this alternate ending is. At least that's my opinion as somebody who's more interested in things like How I Met Your Mother's connection to Love in the Time of Cholera, which is lost in this alternate ending, or what we can take away from looking at this show through a critical lens. If you don't know what I mean, I recommend watching the videos leading up to this one in this little mini-series on the ending that I've been doing. Recently, I keep getting comments on my How I Met Your Mother videos that I look like Ted. And I think what's funny to me about it is that in a lot of ways, I kind of am Ted, except for like the romance dating aspects, in which case I'm a lot more like Robin. Literally this weekend, I'm going to a Renaissance fair, which I go to one every year.
Look what I won at the Renaissance fair.
To be clear, I only said it that way for the joke. Don't come for me. He's also a college professor, and I've taught college classes dressed almost exactly like him. I might not be able to recite from memory Dante's Inferno in its original Italian like Ted can.
Mezzo del cammin de nostra vita. Mi ritrovai per una selva oscura.
But I did make an entire video series on the Divine Comedy and have a 18th century copy of Purgatorio that I adore. Every time someone enters my house, I show them all of my old books, and I just go off on tangents explaining random pieces of history and literature. Two of my best friends from college are basically Lily and Marshall, and they just had a kid at 30, and I have always been their Ted.
Then a thought popped into my head, kids. The same thought that will pop into your heads the first time you see your best friend holding their baby.
Wonder how much this would hurt.
That guy's a dad.
I don't correct people who use the word literally when they mean figuratively.
I literally want to rip your head off.
You mean figuratively?
But I do correct people like Ted who miscorrect people in that way, because literally can mean figuratively. It is part of the definition. Words change over time. That one in particular is a very natural progression for words to change in. It just diminishes in the strength of its meaning. To be honest, like a lot of sitcoms that revolve around a group of friends, I think most of the characters have traits that we might be able to relate to, but it is funny that I relate to Ted probably the most, at least in terms of personality, and apparently in terms of appearance. I actually did eventually find out where the pineapple came from. So really early into How I Met Your Mother, there's an episode called The Pineapple Incident, which is really worthy of its own video. It was the highest rated episode until the finale, which is saying something considering it's episode 10 of a 9-season series. Basically, Ted gets blackout drunk one night and wakes up next to a girl he thinks is Robin, and a pineapple. And over the course of the episode, we find out what happened that night. It's a really great example of the unreliable narration and time manipulation techniques that would become staples in the writing of this show. And throughout the episode, we uncover all the mysteries of that night except where the pineapple came from. And that mystery seems to go unresolved throughout the course of the show. But we do actually get a definitive answer in two places. The first is from a deleted scene for the season 9 episode Daisy, in which we found out what Lily was doing at the captain's house.
What's with the pineapple?
Oh, it's an old sea captain's tradition to put a pineapple on your porch as a symbol of hospitality. I keep one here and one outside my townhouse in the city.
It's not possible.
Ted, you all right, Sailor?
Yeah, I'm good.
Bye, Captain.
And this scene gets canonized in the season 1 finale of How I Met Your Father.
I haven't hurt this bad since someone stole that pineapple off my front doorstep, and not 5.
And I hope these scenes bring anyone who didn't know this some closure on the pineapple incident. Let's talk about assumptions of gender in How I Met Your Mother. When I say assumptions of gender, I mean what the show defines as the qualities that are inherent to men and women. Some commenters assumed I meant assumptions on gender in regards to trans people, and while they are definitely involved in this conversation, and we will touch on them later, I'm actually talking more broadly about the stereotypes and gender roles that How I Met Your Mother either adheres to or subverts. What I think is really interesting about How I Met Your Mother is how a lot of episodes are actually about subverting gender expectations. They start off with some kind of theory about what it means to be a man or a woman, or a relationship between a man and a woman.
See, every woman, no matter how initially repugnant, has a mermaid clock. The time it takes for you to realize you want to bone her.
By the end of the episode, we find out it's more complicated than that, and it's actually not a universal rule that they kind of set up at the beginning. Let's take this statement by Robin as an example.
Men and women need sex to live together. It solves all disputes.
Sort of what the premise of the episode is built around, Robin and Ted having sex to stop their constant fighting as roommates. By the end, Ted calls it off for Barney's sake, and they learn to resolve their problems without having sex, and they continue to be roommates for the next few seasons. Not only is this a very common way for a How I Met Your Mother episode to go, setting up some kind of theory at the beginning of it and then dismantling it by the end. But even all of the main characters themselves very often subvert gender expectations of their time. Barney often engages in feminized behaviors in pursuit of masculinity, like getting his chest waxed.
Oh, you get your chest waxed.
Robin was raised as a boy and is probably the most gender subversive of all of them.
It needs sharpening.
Lily and Marshall very often switch gender roles and expectations.
Chair?
Right here, babe.
And Ted is incredibly emotional. And they often make fun of him for his feminine qualities. It's also where we get to the problem for younger audiences and people watching this in retrospect. Often, the further the show goes in pushing gender boundaries, the less serious it takes its own subversions. And in places where we no longer maintain that assumption of gender, it feels outdated. Like when Ted gets beat up by Natalie in season 1, that was transgressive to show a woman being physically capable of beating up a man. But in order to make that transgression acceptable, they still had to mock Ted for having been able to be beat up by a woman.
Wow. So you got beat up by a girl?
That's how a lot of media in the early 2000s would make that sort of behavior acceptable. Now, for a lot of people, it feels outdated for a woman who knows martial arts to be able to beat up some nerd like Ted. That can create a big difference between us watching it now versus the people who are watching it as it was airing. That's just one example. There's plenty of others like this, and sometimes it's not even really the show's fault. Like, sometimes it's aging because of technology. Ted not waiting the usual 3 days to call a girl was breaking the social norm at the time.
Don't do this. Don't call her the next day. You're blowing this. 3 days. You wait 3 days, Ted.
But even by the end of the show, that was already a social norm that was gone. Not because our understandings of men and women had changed at that point, but rather because dating had changed at that point and technology had changed. The only reason Ted calls the mother the day after meeting her is because he made a comment in an early season that he did that, and at the time that season aired, it made sense. But by the time in 2013, when we saw him calling the mother, it was kind of weird. And now, especially, it's like insane thinking about somebody cold calling somebody instead of texting them. But I think probably one of the more interesting examples of the show being transgressive in a really outdated way now is its depiction of trans people. Every so often, the show will engage in this transphobic trope that was very common at the time, where Ted specifically is afraid of being accidentally attracted to a trans woman.
I remember when I had a penis.
It's not a constant joke, but it is frequent enough to notice on rewatch. Interesting to me about this, though, is that it's built off the premise that trans women can be, and often are, beautiful women. Obviously, that's part of the harm of the trope, because it builds this idea that, like, trans women could be anywhere and could be trying to trick you or whatever. How I Met Your Mother is far from the first to frame trans women this way. It's very interesting how this assumption of their capacity for womanhood is still in that framework. It complicates the expectation we might have of transphobia as it's often depicted now. The expectation is not that trans women are a danger to other women. In fact, they are often embraced by them, at least within this trope, therefore making it harder for a man to decipher who is the trans one. Obviously, that's not saying this is a better or worse form of transphobia. Sometimes things are worth saying just for their mere existence, and how discussing that might help us reframe how we think of the past and the present in this regard. Anyway, the point of all of this is that there's some really interesting assumptions about gender that happen in How I Met Your Mother. And while a lot of it was subversive and transgressive for its time, and we can look at individual examples where it would still be considered that way today, many other instances of its transgressive nature come across as outdated for young people because they no longer fit into our current expectations of what it means to be a man or a woman. Even amongst conservatives and transphobic people, it's different because culture changes, and this was very much trying to make commentary on the societal expectations of its day. A lot has changed in the 10 years since it ended, or the 20 years since it started. In my opinion, this makes it a sort of interesting time capsule to look at. And for me, that's actually part of why I like to look at it from a media studies perspective, like on top of its unreliable narration and like interesting writing techniques. At the same time, it is understandable why that also makes it a lot harder for younger audiences to connect with it. This is a show that is very deeply rooted in the time that it was made, because that is the culture that it is commentating on, for better or worse. I've never noticed this before, and if true, I think it's an interesting attention to detail and likely a subtle nod at Marshall's Midwestern niceness. as well as how he would define his own masculinity and role as a husband. He's very unlikely to let his wife sit in the chair instead of just giving up his own seat at the booth and letting her sit there. There are other potential reasons, but I think this is kind of the Occam's razor answer, like this is the most likely scenario. But I think kind of a more interesting question to ask in general is what that means for their dynamic if Lily is never sitting in the chair. Because we often see different dynamics depending on where people are seated in the booth. Characters sitting next to each other often have more opportunity for humor gags and jokes being made. And while they all start stories no matter where they're seated, the person in the chair is usually the one to initiate this. And when thinking about it that way, despite it being kind of nice that she doesn't have to sit in the chair as often as the other characters do, it's also kind of sad. We'll talk more about this in another video, but Lily is very often defined by her role in other people's lives. One of her biggest struggles throughout the series is the idea that she gave up her own dreams in order to become a wife and mother to other people. And even though she'll start stories from her position in the booth, she never really gets to be the center of attention in the way that other characters do, no matter how hard she tries to be. When you think of some of the most emotional moments for these characters, like the end of The Time Travelers for Ted, or the end of Bad News for Marshall, those episodes are about them. But the one that people tend to cite the most for Lily is in Band or DJ when she's having postpartum. But that episode is otherwise not about her at all. Even the following episode, The Ashtray, which is incredibly important to her hopes and dreams, is not primarily her telling the story. Her own story gets originally told by Ted and then Robin and then finally Lily. And I just can't help but feel like it's true that she never sits at the chair at the bar, if Marshall always gets up for her, her life is still being defined by other people. And like her capacity to tell stories the way that the other characters do is still being redefined. Again, I don't know necessarily if this is true. I mean, like, you'd have to pay very careful attention to this specific spot in every episode. And I haven't done that, although I do think it would be interesting to do so and to see like how these dynamics evolve and like how, you know, which person is at which spot in the booth, like what that says about the episode and whatnot. But if this is true, I think it's kind of sad. How I Met Your Mother fun fact, not only did they use common techniques for hiding a pregnancy, like having her sit behind a table, but both of Alyson Hannigan's pregnancies were actually used to write plots for her character. The second time in season 7 was the obvious choice, and not that uncommon, which is having her character get pregnant. And that's something that probably would have happened around then anyway. But the first time was in season 4 when Alyson Hannigan wanted to go on maternity leave, so they wrote in this joke.
What's the difference between peanut butter and jam? See, it's funny.
It's boy funny. She's not gonna like it.
Why don't you let me decide? What's the difference between peanut butter and jam?
And then Barney said the punchline. To this day, it's still the dirtiest joke I've ever heard in my life. And no, I'm not gonna say it.
Yeah, I can't hang out with you anymore.
Oh, come on! That's a funny joke.
Told you.
She'll be back.
And we didn't see Lily for 4 weeks.
That's the opening scene to season 4, episode 20, and she doesn't come back until the final scene of season 4, episode 23, right before the finale.
So what have you been up to?
I'm going through an amnesia ward with a bunch of photos of my children and a wedding ring. I'm going to find the hottest patient/my wife, and we are going to...
Okay, so that's good enough for tonight. I gotta ease back into this. See you tomorrow.
Because of this absence, Lily is the only main character besides the mother that is not in every episode of the show. Ted, Marshall, Barney, and Robin are in every single episode. Even when Kobe Summers was pregnant at the same time as Alyson Hannigan in season 4, she stayed on the show. I think this is a very funny, cool, and interesting way to temporarily write out a character, and it's awesome that Alyson Hannigan was able to go on maternity leave during this long-running popular show she was on. But it does highlight a sort of expendability to Lily's character that builds off of what I was talking about in this video. Jason Siegel did not want to be in the final season at all, yet he is in every episode. I'll bet missing from big chunks of them, but he's still in every episode. Again, Summers was pregnant at the same time as Hannigan, yet she did not miss a single episode. I'm not saying this was a bad thing, but it is part of a larger pattern that we'll be getting into at some point, where the show is willing to sacrifice time and even growth with Lily. Having having some of her most emotional moments in episodes that are not otherwise about her, like I talked about in this video, or at the end where we don't get much of a resolution about her job after Rome. But whenever I see this joke in season 4, I appreciate the cleverness and metatextual utility of it, but it is a bit bittersweet. Let's talk about the symbolism of Ted's hanging Chad costume.
What? She thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, 4 years ago, but nobody remembers what the hell a hanging Chad is.
What a sad commentary on our national attention span, that we could forget such a turbulent time in our political history.
If you don't know what a hanging Chad is, basically in the year 2000, the election between Al Gore and George W. Bush was an incredibly close one. And for a while, it was unclear who actually won the presidency because Florida used these punch card ballots, and any of them that had a hanging Chad were not actually scanned into the system. And during the month-long recount where Florida had to find and count all of these ballots, it was unclear who was going to be the president. And since the original count had George Bush winning, this hanging Chad effectively is a symbol for Al Gore and the people who voted for him of the possibility that Al Gore would actually get to be president. And because so many of these were thrown out, it is still kind of unclear who should have won that presidency. The hanging Chad represents the hope of an alternate future. In the original case, that being Al Gore winning the presidency, but in Ted's case, that being him finding love.
I want the slutty pumpkin to recognize me, and she knows me as a hanging Chad.
So on the surface, this is obviously a symbol of his enduring hope that he will find the slutty pumpkin again. But in a grander sense, this symbolizes his continuous hope that he will find love someday. The reference to the hanging Chad is old even when Ted first wears this costume, and every single year it gets older and older. And from the start of the show, Ted already feels like he should have met the one by now, so it gets harder and harder to continuously have hope that he will. Yet without fail, he continues to wear the hanging Chad costume in hopes of finding love. This is what makes the final Halloween we see so powerful for him, because he is continuing to wear this costume, but he has finally found his Al Gore voter. It's not just Ted now symbolically living in that month of the possibility that Al Gore might win, but it is him and Tracy together doing so. You like video essays, I'm sure you've seen this channel, but I caution against watching videos from The Take. Because while they look professional, their videos seem to primarily be based on vibes, are filled with misinformation, and are constantly taking clips out of context and using them to prove points that those clips do not prove in context. Let's use this video for example, the struggle of being the new friend. You might assume this video is going to be about the new friend trope and the narrative function that it serves. Like in How I Met Your Mother, the friends often tell Robin things that they would already know about each other so that the audience can then learn about it.
So I have to ask, there's a story here.
Please.
But that's not what's happening here. The point of this video is basically just, it's hard to be a new friend in an adult friend group, and here are 2 examples of that happening in media. But here's where the weird misinformation comes around, because they correctly identify Robin as the new friend, but then they say Phoebe is the new friend on Friends. Even though narratively at the beginning of the story, that is the role Rachel is filling. Like, she is there to introduce us to the other characters because, like the audience, she doesn't really know anything about them, and they are already an established friend group. She just knows a few of them. But even if we don't count Rachel because she did know some of them before, Joey entered the friend group after Phoebe, and he has just as few connections to the rest of the cast as she does. So it's just straight up not true that Phoebe is the new friend in any sense, but what is really mind-boggling to me is that they use this clip to show that she is the new friend.
We haven't known each other for that long a time, and there are 3 things that you should know about me. 1, my friends are the most important thing in my life.
But the reason that she's saying this to Rachel is because at this point in the story, Rachel is the new friend. Rachel is the one who doesn't know the friend group. She just knows Monica and Ross from childhood. And technically Chandler, but she doesn't remember that, and also it probably wasn't written into the show yet in season 1. But this is a conversation Phoebe is having as a member of the friend group already, with a new friend entering that friend group. And the reason this frustrates me so much is because The Take does this in so many videos. Almost all of their videos have a moment where they manipulate a clip out of context like this. And it's always to make some kind of made-up claim that has no evidence to it, and they back it up with nothing other than this clip taken out of context. And the point that they're trying to make in this video is that Phoebe is on like the outskirts of the friend group because she's the new friend, which they could have just said she's on the outskirts of the friend group without pretending like she's the new friend, but they wanted to frame it around this whole thing. Anyways, the point that they're trying to make is that she is a good example of the new friend because it works out for her in the end. But Robin is like a bad example of it going in the wrong direction for her being the new friend because it doesn't work out for her in the end. And they could have just had an interesting, actually analytical video on how Robin being the new friend puts her on the outskirts of the friend group. But again, they wanted to make this video just about like what it's like to be the new friend. And if you wanted to do that, then why didn't you just use Joey? He would have made so much more sense, proving the same exact point. I'm sure not all of them are bad, but I have so many problems with most of the Takes videos, and they feel like perfect examples of influencing people to be worse at understanding media. Because this is not any kind of analytical essay, and it is filled with misinformation, misusing scenes from the show. They have plenty of other videos doing the exact same thing that I have actively seen people repeat the misinformation that they are sharing. So yeah, there are some other The Take videos on How I Met Your Mother especially that I will be talking about, but in general, I completely understand why someone would like a video from The Take, and I hope that they get better and stop doing this, but in the meantime, I highly recommend that you avoid watching their videos, or at the very least, avoid believing what's said in them. I feel like some people thought I would be unwilling to talk about this, but let's dust off the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies minor because I've seen a lot of people misunderstand what grape culture is while defending the show, but probably just as many people mischaracterizing the show itself when discussing its contribution. Some people defending the show might say that Barney's actions are over the top and meant to be seen as morally reprehensible, both of which are true. But that's not always the case, nor does it mean that it's not worth discussing. At the same time, I've seen multiple comments say that Barney specifically popularized certain aspects of grape culture, even ones that he just didn't do in the show. And when we mischaracterize specific aspects like that, we're actually excusing the real world people and media that did popularize it, and instead placing the blame on a fictional character who didn't. But again, just because he did not do that specifically does not mean there's nothing to talk about here, so let's get into it. First, let's define what grape culture is exactly. Effectively, it is the way our culture subtly normalizes grape. We may think of the actual act of assault as a horrible but rare occurrence, but then normalizing unserious, joking discussions of it and being dismissive towards victims, such as not believing women or shaming male victims, or dismissing certain non-consensual acts because they're not an extremely violent version of SA that you've imagined grape to be. For example, Barney most frequently engages with something that we might call grape by fraud. Very often, women seem to consent to having sex with him and are very enthusiastic in their yes. However, they do so under false pretenses, with the idea that Barney is something that he's actually not. That's effectively what most of his plays are. Like, sure, sometimes he's just doing something goofy and the girl is charmed by it and then they go have sex. Most of the time he's explicitly lying about who he is and even will sometimes trick the girl in other ways as well. And this is an example of something that people even in real life might excuse as not being grape even though it's not consensual. You can't agree to something if you don't know what you're actually agreeing to. Now again, the way in which Barney is tricking women is really over-exaggerated and over the top, and people understand that it's a bad thing. We're not expected to laugh at the women, but rather Barney and the weird ways in which he's really desperate to have sex with new women. But even though we can acknowledge that it's bad, and even the show sometimes explicitly says that it is and that he's sociopathic, it's still treating it kind of unseriously. And that aspect of it subtly contributes to this idea that it's not as serious as, like, violent non-consensual acts. And that's something to be aware of and deconstruct while watching this show. But at the same time, it's very harmful to look at Barney as the origin of any of this. His grape culture was first identified in 1980 and our understanding of it developed throughout the 90s. And while the general public wasn't talking about it as much until the 2010s, it was still very much a thing way before this show ever came out. And Barney is actually a product of it rather than like the originator of it. In many ways, he's meant to parody frat bro culture, and in some ways he has contributed to it, but for the most part, he is a product of it. We see a lot of similar things throughout these decades in popular shows, but in scenarios where we're not necessarily expected to laugh at them or think of them as a bad person. That is the unfortunate reality. Before 2010, there are many shows that have a lot of grape jokes in them, or even more dubious consent situations that are not depicted the way it is here. Which is not to say that it should be excused or ignored. It should be thought about as we're viewing these older media, idea. But we also can't just pick one and decide this is the one that actually caused the problem and normalized everything. Because it's not how this culture works and actually ignores so much more harm. And I've talked about this before, but I will make a video talking more about the cult of personality surrounding Barney, like at some point. And there is more to talk about this there, but it's good to have a full understanding of the concept and how it works within the show while having these discussions. I have so much to say about how they handled Lily's sexuality in How I Met Your Mother, both good and bad.
Let's make out.
Are you sure?
Yeah, baby, I'm sure.
Okay, well, you know what? I mean, it probably won't even work. It's stupid. I'm stupid.
Shh. You're beautiful.
Before getting into any analysis, we'll start off with the obvious continuity error. In the final season, Lily and Robin kiss, and afterwards, Robin is like, we should do that again. And Lily's like, I wasn't really that into it. It didn't feel right to me.
Guys, you don't get to see this kiss either. So where should we go? Closet? Patio? Ooh, I think the sauna's open.
Well, I actually, to be honest, it felt kind of weird to me. Once was enough.
Totally. We could kiss. We could not kiss. We could kiss.
The joke here is that it's supposed to feel like a role reversal because Lily was always the one trying to get them to kiss before. She seemed to be into the idea much more so than Robin.
Hey, I dare you guys to dare us to make out.
The problem with this, though, is that they've already kissed not just once in season 1, but also for a second time in season 7, literally just 2 seasons before the final one.
No? Okay.
Lily has consistently showed interest in women, especially Robin, throughout the series.
I can't stop thinking about you and Robin.
Oh, I've had that a couple times. Just lean into it and let it fuel things.
And like, maybe we can excuse them for forgetting season 1 because even though this show is typically pretty good about continuity, it is still a syndicated sitcom that has been going on for like 8 years at that point. But this was just 2 years before. And again, this was so consistent for her that it feels like they removed one of her character traits in the final season. But even on a deeper level, the final season kind of diminishes the symbolic significance of Lily's bi-curiosity. From the very beginning of the show, Lily's character arc has revolved around her feeling like she has given up all of her hopes and dreams in the pursuit of being a wife and eventually mother.
The travel, the bohemian art life, my big lesbian experience. I didn't do any of it.
This moment right here is because she's thinking about all of the things she wanted to do after high school that she didn't end up doing. And one of the most basic ones was kiss a girl. And this kiss was Robin showing her that it's not too late to accomplish her goals.
You can still travel. I mean, you can still paint. And as far as your lesbian experience, happy.
Yeah. You can still explore her sexuality, see what it's like to live outside of New York, and pursue art as a career. And in the very next episode, she goes to an audition for an art fellowship that would eventually lead her to going to San Francisco at the end of season 1. This kiss is an incredibly significant moment in Lily's life, and it's not surprising that she's more attracted to Robin afterwards.
I mean, she's great and sweet. I'm not going to pretend that I haven't noticed her body.
Throughout the rest of the show, her references to her sexuality basically go from her being a bi-curious woman.
Robin Scherbatsky is many things. Friend, confidant, occasional guest star in some confusing dreams that remind me a woman's sexuality is a moving target.
To being completely bisexual by the end of season 7.
Oh my god, my secret crush is here. Mila Kunis? No, my secret crush.
It's a subtle but consistent background character growth of her embracing aspects of herself that have nothing to do with Marshall. While it's often used for comedic effect, the comedy of it, especially in the later seasons, is usually about how silly Lily's acting, not about the sexuality itself.
Let's give this Danish hoe a name. I'm thinking Nadia. Yeah, she sounds slutty and bi-curious.
It's no longer her wanting to have a big lesbian moment, it's just one of her character traits. That's why the aftermath of this feels so weird, aside from the obvious continuity problem of them already having kissed twice. You could imagine this as a conclusion to the bi-curious Lily of seasons 1 and 2. Now that she has succeeded in art and is going to live in Rome, this could feel like closure to her original goals. Like, now she feels comfortable letting go of this dream that she had because she's already accomplished everything else. She can take this for something that it really is, as in something that she doesn't want to pursue. And while theoretically that sounds like a plausible reading, it doesn't actually make sense. In a way that's very similar to how people critique the ending of the show, the story here has gone off so far from what it was in season 1. This isn't just about her bi-curiosity anymore, and we got to a point where the story they had told doesn't make sense to end like this.
It's stupid. I'm stupid. So stupid.
Because firstly, not only has Lily kissed Robin 3 times, but this is the 3rd time Robin has kissed Lily. So why would she suddenly now be interested in it? Like, that part of it, there's no explanation. If Lily said she wasn't interested again first, and then Robin wanted to pursue it, that would make sense, because it would be like, oh, she didn't realize how much she wanted it when Lily was after her. But that's not what happened. Robin approached Lily first after the kiss. Aside from that, Lily's sexuality has continuously been re-cemented outside of Robin.
She's a goddess. Her skin glows, her legs go for miles, and that ass? I would wear that thing for a hat. Last night in bed, I'll admit it, she popped into my head a couple of times.
And between her getting a job with the captain and this moment happening, there's a whole year of her still interested in Robin.
You, me, and this guy naked going at it. Then he gets tired and it's just you and me going at it. Let me that'd be so stupid.
And there's no like symbolic closure in reversing it onto Robin. Of course, on top of all of that, in order to make this work, they had to pretend like they never kissed before, and that's just not true. As I've said in multiple videos now, this is in line with how Lily's character is sometimes treated as an afterthought, and a lot of her growth is taken away in place of all the other characters. She has a very interesting character arc, but it's unfortunate how much it gets fumbled in Band or DJ or this scene or the finale, which are more things that we will be getting into soon. In the meantime, let me know if you have alternative interpretations of this scene or Lily's sexuality in general, and the way that I like to handle this is by just thinking that it's pregnancy hormones that are causing her to not be interested anymore after the kiss.
Oh, I'm done with pregnancy brain. I've moved on to weird pregnancy sex dreams. Officer. You know. You know.
Because that is the only explanation that really makes sense in my mind. And Robin's down to kiss again because it's her wedding and she's nervous. It just feels like the interesting queer theory readings we could have had of Lily were disrupted by this ending just to make a silly joke. And unfortunately, it comes at the expense of her sexuality that she'd been thinking about since college. By the end of the show, before this point, had been fully acknowledged as just part of who she is.
Lily dream banged someone we know. You know who I bet it is? Robin.
Personally, I always appreciated how the other characters fully acknowledged her sexuality and didn't just ignore her comments as if they were just a joke. Like, multiple times, Marshall gets jealous when she's talking about women just as he would if she was talking about men. It's just surprising to see that from a show that was clearly made for straight people that started in 2005. It was interesting to see references to her sexuality become more frequent and sort of solidified as part of who she is, even though it was never like a major part of her character. And while there's still interesting things to say about the sexuality of all of the characters, this was just a disappointing note to end the conversation on Lily's, and generally felt like a character assassination. At least for this one aspect of her that had been consistent for 9 seasons.
That says that Barney was probably not as much of a jerk or even a womanizer as he was portrayed to be, but that the story was narrated by future Ted trying to get his children to approve of him dating Robin again. So future Ted had to make the man Robin married look like the bad guy in the story.
So this theory was pretty much fully debunked in How I Met Your Father, where we see outside of Ted's narration that this is how Barney really is. However, I've already talked before about how I don't really like this theory even outside of How I Met Your Father, and today I want to talk about it from a media literacy perspective. When we see theories like this, even if our impulse is to agree with them because we would like for it to be true, we should question what they're saying. Does their argument make sense, and is there actually evidence for their claim? In this case, the answer to both is no. And before we really get into it, I just want to say it's okay to have whatever headcanon you want. Like, if you want to believe this is true while you're watching the show, that's fine. But we should be cautious about presenting headcanons as like legitimate theories. Because I've seen a lot of smart people in my comments who are interested in looking at How I Met Your Mother critically who have been told this theory before as if it was a true fact. And the reality is I would not go as far to call this a theory, but rather just a headcanon. Which again, it's okay to have headcanons, but let's break down why this doesn't really work as a theory. So first of all, the motivation for Ted to make Barney look bad because Barney was married to Robin doesn't make any sense. Because Robin and Barney got divorced when Ted's daughter was 1 and Ted's son was not born yet. These kids were not around for those two being together. And while I'm sure they were aware that Barney and Robin had been married, this story is probably the most they have ever heard their relationship been told in a romantic way, because people don't usually hype up their friends' past relationships as being particularly romantic. There's no reason for these kids to think that Barney and Robin should be together more than Ted and Robin before hearing this story, especially because after they get divorced, neither one is telling their friends that they want to get back together, let alone telling the kids that they should get back together. On top of all that, Ted is not telling this story to his kids in order to look good for Robin. He doesn't need to convince his kids to like him. Notice how in the end, when the kids say, this is a story about how you want to get with Robin, they say, Dad, we love Robin. Of course this is okay. I'm not saying, don't worry, Dad, you've convinced us that you're a good guy and so you deserve to be with someone awesome like Robin. They're saying, Robin is great and thus deserves to be with you, our dad, who we love. And despite the fact that a lot of people seem to talk about Ted as if he makes himself look particularly good, he actually calls out his own actions very frequently. He calls himself a jerk. He says, I did these things wrong, I made these mistakes, because he's trying to teach lessons to his kids, and he's comfortable saying that, making himself look like a bad guy very often because he's not worried that his kids are not going to like him. That's also why he isn't like constantly hyping up their mother, because they know that he loved her. They watched it happen. They were there to witness him be in love with her. And in addition to the fact that Ted doesn't really have motivation to make Barney look bad, I also have issues with the claim that he's even doing that to begin with. Because while Barney does some particularly bad stuff, Ted is telling a story about his character growth. Like, he is growing as a character in each season and becoming a better person by the end of it. And he's also comfortable telling his kids all of the lies that the rest of his friends and himself are telling, because they all lie. I think the reason people gravitate towards this theory is because Barney is more likable than Ted, and people want to feel like they are liking a good person. On top of that, we know Ted is an unreliable narrator, so it's easy for them to think, oh, he's just making Barney look worse than he actually is. But I think a much better theory in regards to how Ted's unreliable narration affects Barney's character is the surrealism in Barney's stories is likely over-exaggerated by Ted, and the ability for Barney to actually do the things that Ted says he does. And that's much more in line with the type of unreliable narration that Ted does. He wants to make the story more interesting. But if we try to understand this show through a critical lens, it doesn't really make any sense that Ted would lie about who Barney is as a person. I mean, his kids know Barney. They could just talk about these stories with him, and if Barney's like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, there's going to be a discrepancy. And as I said at the beginning, it pretty much was confirmed in How I Met Your Father that this is how Barney really is, because it was being told outside of Ted's narration, and Sophie very much has no reason to lie. Because to her, this is just some random guy whose car she hit. I love when people look into Ted's unreliable narration and start to investigate like deeper meanings and potential theories because of it. However, we got to be careful about letting our biases affect our interpretations too much, and also distinguishing headcanons from critical theories. Ted actually doesn't pursue Robin for the vast majority of How I Met Your Mother. In fact, after their breakup in season 2, each of them turns each other down twice. For Ted, this happens near the end of season 5 while Robin is with Dawn, and Ted realizes that he still likes her after seasons of seemingly not. And again in season 7 after Robin and Kevin break up, which is a very notable plot point.
You love me? No.
For Robin, the first time this happens is near the beginning of season 4 when she goes to Ted's wedding to tell him that he shouldn't get married to Stella.
I don't know. I just thought if I ever changed my mind about marriage and kids, it was nice to know that you were there.
Why are you bringing any of this up? There's nothing between us anymore.
Well, maybe there is. I mean, of course there is. That kind of stuff just doesn't disappear without a trace.
And then at the end of season 9, an hour before she's about to get married to Barney, and she's asking Ted to run away with her.
Wait, what are you saying?
Maybe I should be marrying you.
Technically, there's also a moment at the beginning of season 6 where Robin shows interest in Ted and he shuts her down, but it's played off for jokes because it's during her, like, breakup phase after Dawn.
Okay, I'm ready to have
sex now.
And there's also a deleted scene that would have taken place during the finale where Robin expresses regret for not being with Ted, but he is now with Tracy.
I've been feeling crazy for thinking about it, but now that I know that you feel the same way too, I don't feel crazy anymore.
I meant, how did we end up here at this restaurant instead of McLaren's?
Wow.
There are moments outside of these where Ted especially expresses interest to his friends or to the audience, mostly in the first 2 and the last 2 seasons. But in the totality of the show, there is very, very few moments of Ted actually going to Robin and saying that he wants to be with her, or vice versa. The main exception being season 1, where they're mutually interested in each other, but Robin doesn't want to be with Ted because Ted clearly wants things that she doesn't at that moment and is very extra. I think that's why there's this impression that there's some kind of constant pursuit throughout the series, when that really isn't the case. I think that's important context to understanding both of these characters and their relationship as a whole throughout the series. Because despite these scenes, along with the ones that show their mutual attraction to each other, there is a lot of the series where they really are just friends, or primarily friends. I think it does a really good job at blurring the lines between the platonic and romantic, which on a personal note, I find very relatable, although incredibly uncommon, especially in like straight shows. Seasons where they are platonic exes and roommates, but also making deals to get married if they're 40 are some of the most fascinating to me and surprisingly relatable. I find interesting about the way people often talk about How I Met Your Mother is that there are things genuinely worth critiquing about the show, but the vast majority of things I see people talking about are stuff that either didn't happen or didn't happen the way people are saying they did. The thing is, most good media criticism is going to require a level of nuance, even when it's critiquing that media. Like, we can talk about how Lily's individual character arc is given less screen time and emotional weight than the other characters. Her most compelling scene is in Band or DJ, an episode that is otherwise not about her at all. Or how Barney is clearly a satirization of early 2000s bro culture, but there's this question of intent versus impact, where you could argue that he contributed to it just as much as he critiqued it. Or you could point out the fact that Ted has this fear of women secretly being trans, which was a popular joke in media during the early 2000s / late 90s, and has resurfaced a lot in recent years. But for whatever reason, I think people don't find those condemnable enough, and that is often the goal with moralizing media, is some kind of condemnation either of the show itself or the characters, or they're not even looking at the show that closely and just don't like Ted because he reminds them of people in their real life who act in a somewhat similar way, but significantly worse. So they attribute all of those worse traits onto him, even if he never actually exhibits them. Either way, for whatever reason, while a few people might be making the critiques I was talking about earlier, the vast majority of them will be saying things like, Ted is hounding Robin the whole show to try and get into a relationship with her, even though that's just not what happens. And as a media studies educator, I think having stuff like this can be useful as a tool for helping students learn how to unpack their biases and preconceived ideas or initial responses to a piece of media that they're engaging with. But it can also be very frustrating with how pervasive it is in the way people talk about this show. I actually don't have a problem with reader response style criticism. Like, I think it's fine if your personal experience goes into your interpretation of a piece of media. The problem is that when you treat that like it's the objective interpretation of that piece of media. Unfortunately, that's often something that really needs to be unpacked when it's a piece of media that is critiquing aspects of a culture that is very ingrained to its time period. So like How I Met Your Mother is very involved in critiquing gender and relationship dynamics in the early 2000s. And in doing so, it also ends up reflecting some of those conventions that, if you're not looking at it critically, can be uncomfortable to watch for modern, younger audiences sometimes. Which again, there's nothing wrong with. I just wish it was easier for people to disconnect their personal feelings and reactions to something, instead of making revisionist takes that make their response to it feel more legitimate. Because again, most of the time, what does happen usually is something that is worth critiquing. So if you actually have a problem with those aspects of what happens within the show, then you can just say that, and you don't have to make up all of this stuff.